how to render the sphere. So to speed things up and make things a little bit easier to understand, I created a diagram. Now, when I do the demo live in class, I usually draw this out, so it takes a little bit more time, but I want to be able to explain things a little clearer on the video. So basically what we're doing is we're taking a flat object, a circle, and we're going to add value to that in gradients with a light source, and we're going to take that circle and make it into a 3D object we call a sphere. So on this diagram we have, I'm going to explain a few things. So the orange star there is going to be our light source, so everything is going to revolve around that. So we'll start off at the top. When a light hits a round object, it radiates in every direction. So if you look at the grid of the sphere with the blue lines, you can see that represents the sphere being round in all directions. And the thing to understand about light is light doesn't bend or curve. It just goes straight and it can bounce. So on this, you're going to see two lines coming from our light source in orange, and those are called light vectors. A vector is the path that the light is traveling down. And then you'll see a small rectangle at the bottom labeled surface. When light hits a surface, it will bounce. Okay, and we're calling that reflected light. So when light hits that sphere, it doesn't go past the apex, and the apex are the widest parts of that round object or the sphere. So the apex is the widest part of any object. And because of that, and that the sphere is rounding, that means it's moving away from the light. So that's why you have that smooth gradient or those midtones, the transition from light to dark. And in the part of the sphere that is farthest from the light, so the opposite side of the light source, you're going to get a dark, dark shadow called a core shadow. So in this diagram, I illustrated how that core shadow is formed and why it takes this crescent shape. So the sphere is round in every direction. If you follow the grid, you'll see how it curves away from the light. This is why that core shadow is a crescent shape. Light does not come into contact with the sphere past the apex. So because light is traveling at a straight line, that means once it passes the widest part of the sphere, it is no longer directly hitting it, and all you're getting is reflected light or ambient light. If you look over to the right, you're going to see a photograph that I took of a sphere, and you're going to see that principle that I'm talking about in the diagram actually in a photo. So the core shadow or crescent, it will change depending on the type of light. So if you put a flashlight on that's a harsh light, you're going to get a very strong crescent. If you're using like a light bulb or a lamp as your light source, you're going to get a fatter crescent. And then also the distance between the light source and the sphere is going to determine how dark the core shadow is and how big it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this information and I'm going to put it down on paper. So that's going to be the next step. All right, just to save us some time, I already laid out a few things on the paper for the demo. And then when I get into the actual shading part, what I'll do is I'll speed up the film, but it's important to know a couple of things. So one, up here, I have a crescent shadow laid out. I have my light source. I'm showing the apex on the left and the right, and I'm showing those vectors crossing the sphere. The other thing I did was what a lot of people do by mistake. Your crescent should be able to complete itself inside of the circle or inside of the sphere. If your crescent starts to lead off the sphere, it doesn't matter how well you shade, this will always appear flat because the directional movement's going off the sphere. So that's one thing to really check when you're doing this. You want to avoid what I call the oops or the oopsilon because that is the Greek letter you're making with this. So this is a big thing to avoid and to practice not doing. So again, if your crescent doesn't look like it's going to wrap around itself, then you drew the shape wrong. The other thing that people do when they make a mistake shading, why their renderings come out flat instead of three-dimensional, is they shade in one direction. And it doesn't matter how well you shade, if all your lines are traveling in the same direction, your drawing will always be flat. So we need to take this into consideration when we're rendering anything that is round. in this case, a sphere. So one question I ask all the time is, can I make a curve with a straight line? I usually get about a 50-50 response, but the answer is yes. And you do it every day with your hand, right? Your hand has straight bones, and then if you simply turn your fingers and change the angles, you can form the letter C, which is a curved object. So when you're shading, okay, I'm going to move this up a little bit. When you're shading, I can draw straight lines, change the angle, change the angle, change the angle. What happens is you're going to get a curve. And it's important to understand this while you're shading, because we're going to be shading this direction, but we're also going to be shading this direction while we're rendering the sphere. So we're starting off with our core shadow. Our direct light's going to hit somewhere up here. Now, we don't draw where our direct light's hitting. If I come over here, I can say my direct light is hitting there. And then as it moves away, just like on the diagram, you're going to get less and less light on the sphere as it wraps around. And that's why you get that smooth gradient. And then when you get to the opposite side of the sphere, the opposite side of the light source, that's where you get that core shadow. So everything I do, I'm going to work out of my core shadow. And then underneath here, this is going to be my reflected light. So this is the light hitting the table, bouncing up, hitting the table, and bouncing. So it'll be a little bit stronger here than it would be here, because the light has farther to travel. So I'm going to start shading, and I'm going to talk while I'm shading, and then eventually I'll just speed it up. So I'm going to start creating my map, and my map is basically going to go to my light source. So I want to work in all directions. I want to work in all directions into my sphere. So my lines have to travel this way. So when I'm shading, this is what I have to keep in mind, right? So I can't just shade everything going in the same direction. So eventually everything's going to move into where the light source is hitting. And my core shadow basically acts like kind of like a map and a guide for me. And then afterwards I'll come down and I'll add the reflected light. The reflected light's generally only going to be 1 to 2 values lighter than the core shadow. If it's a light surface like white paper, it'll be a lot lighter than that core shadow. But typically it's only going to be 1 or 2 values less. So you're going to see me change my angle. So when I'm shading like this, and as I move up, I'm coming around, and I'm doing that all throughout the sphere. And this is basically what it looks like. It's almost like your fingers doing this. And by doing that, I start to create a round object, and you can see how that object is starting to become round just right there in that little diagram. So you always see a little bit of the other side of the sphere too. So there will be some light values up there. And when I put in my map, I work in super light. And this just kind of guides me for shading. It prevents me from shading in one direction. And you're going to see me rotate my paper. And I want to rotate my paper because, again, my focus is getting those lines in a different direction, and I don't want to like move my wrist in an awkward angle. The other thing that I do is I'll be moving back and forth on my pencil. Okay, so right now I'm back here on the pencil just to put in those lines. And then I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So I'm going to be shading this way too. And I'm going to start working my way down into my reflected light. but I'm always keeping in mind of my core shadow. One of the things I preach is building your values. So I like to build up to my dark values. This helps me have more control over my midtones. And I just find it's easier and more forgiving than if you try to just go straight to dark values. The other added bonus is it smooths out your lines quite a bit. Okay. So again, you can start seeing my map. You can see how my lines are moving towards where that light source is. And again, one of the things I always do is I always pause a little bit, and I want to make sure that I am moving into my established light source and not just kind of randomly shading. Okay, so there you can see there's my light source. Direct path is where my highlight's going to be. That's going to be my direct light. This whole area is going to be my midtones. This is going to be my core shadow. This will be my reflected light. And then the only other thing I need to do is my casted shadow. Since the light is hitting here, that means my casted shadow is going to be back here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, okay, so my light's sitting there, that means that shadow has to be directly behind it. Round objects cast round shadows. Okay, so when we do this, we want to kind of move in elliptical fashion. And then the darkest part of the shadow is going to be right underneath the sphere. And this will also help with the three-dimensional effect. Because now you're establishing space, right? That this thing exists in a three-dimensional space. And then this is the table it's sitting on. I'm just going to put some light values in for the table. And as your shadow moves farther away from your object, it's going to get a little fuzzy, and then it's going to get lighter, right? So it's going to fade the farther it gets away. Again, it's important to move in that elliptical fashion. Okay, so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed up the film, and I'm just going to finish rendering this. You should be able to see the map, so you can see the direction I'm going to move into. Hopefully, the camera picked up the different angles that I was working in. So I'm going to speed it up at this point. Okay, so I'm going to stop the rendering right now. A couple of things I would point out. One, I'm working on a relatively hard surface, so one thing that I would change was I put more padding underneath this. That could be more paper, it could be a folder, just something softer, and that'll help with some of the blending. The other thing that I'm trying to show and not do is we don't want to smudge. We could smudge and make this thing look really nice and smooth, but we want to focus on blending with a pencil. So this isn't easy, right, when you're starting off. It's going to take you a bunch of times to get it to start to look right. So when we're doing our practice, you guys are going to be rendering anywhere from 4 to 6 spheres at minimum, and hopefully by your fifth one or sixth one, you're picking it up and it's making it a little bit easier for you before you work on our actual rendering and sphere assignment. So please understand, it takes practice. Couple of tips. Again, have a softer surface. Harder surface makes it hard to blend, and don't try to rush through it. So you're going to see a sped up part of the video. Understand, as fast as I felt like I went, it still was about 15-20 minutes for rendering a very small sphere. You can see how big it is compared to my hand, so it's not very big at all. Keep in mind that time and patience, those are the two things that will make this work. So till next time, this is Mr. Aguilar.